Good morning, AWS, and welcome to the AWS Morning Brief. Now that the craziness that is reInvent has finally died down somewhat, we're back to a more reasonable and sedate pace of releases. But first, you have AWS problems. This episode is sponsored in part by AWS Solutions, a bunch of pre-built answers to common things you might be trying to do with either third-party solutions, first-party AWS solutions, put together in a way that's easy to understand, easy to implement into your environment, and frankly gets you further faster without you having to reinvent the wheel yourself. To learn more, visit snark.cloud/AWS Solutions, and my thanks to them for their support of this ridiculous podcast. Now, what happened last week in AWS? Mostly an awful lot of cleanup, as it turns out. Alexa for Business adds end-of-meeting reminders, intelligent room releases, and meeting room utilization metrics. There are a few challenging things in there, but first, you now have a robot barging in to tell you that your meeting is over and it's time for you to get the hell out. Fair enough. Secondly, the idea of having intelligent room release means that in the event you ignore the robot, your coworkers crashing in for their meeting will certainly get you moving on your way. And of course, the meeting room utilization metrics. That's right, making sure that people know exactly how much time you're spending in meetings rather than writing code is the stuff that positive workplace cultures are built upon. I see no way for this to end badly. Amazon Connect announces AWS CloudTrail support for APIs. The consensus around this is it's about time. There's a guest we've had on the Screaming in the Cloud podcast named Ian Mackay out of Australia, who is not just a brilliant developer, but a full-on code terrorist. He's built a solution that worked around this for a long time, which involved a lot of terrible things, most notably headless Chrome running inside of a Lambda function that then would navigate the individual authenticated pages and click in the appropriate spots to configure Connect. Sadly and fortunately, all at the same time, we don't have to deal with that nonsense anymore. Amazon EC2 Spot now provides instance launch notifications via CloudWatch events. Awesome. So now you can have an event fire off every time an instance launches when a Spot request is fulfilled. That's super useful for things like metrics, dashboards, etc., and super psychotic if you're the type of person or organization to hook that kind of event up to triggering PagerDuty alerts at 3 in the morning. We scaled up again is not the sort of thing to wake up your engineers with unless you enjoy being assaulted in the morning. Amazon FSx, picture that being the equivalent of EFS, only for Windows, adds enhancements to the AWS Management Console. It turns out that as much as we'd like to believe otherwise, people do still use the Management Console for draggity-pokety and clickety-clickety to set things up. They begrudgingly acknowledge this by launching a series of improvements to the console, which is awesome. One of the frustrating parts for me has always been that the console experience for different services is so disconnected. For some, it's amazing and absolutely best of breed. For others, it doesn't even work on an iPad. I'm not going to name names yet, but if you're on a service team listening to this podcast, you should probably start to sweat. Amazon SageMaker Ground Truth adds auto-segment feature for semantic segmentation labeling. Do you know what that means? Of course not. No one knows what that means. I had to do some digging. Here's what it means. You draw 4 points on an image, and it automatically will build a tight mask around the object contained within those 4 points. Now, why would they describe it the way that they did? Well, it's machine learning. I assume it's a machine learning trained algorithm that wrote that blog post and then decided to explain it to other machine learning algorithms rather than human beings, because a human being understands it the way that I just described it. I'm not saying I'm better than computers. I am saying I'm funnier and more understandable most days. You can now attach multiple elastic inference accelerators to a single EC2 instance, which does raise the question, how the hell fast is that EC2 instance going to go? What happens if it hits another one? Have we built an EC2 instance collider? We can discover new superimposed EC2 instance states if we wind up having enough fragments left over. This will unlock the secrets of the origin of AWS itself. But enough about strange mysteries. Let's talk instead about more entertaining things. This episode is also sponsored in part by Chaos Search. That's right, Chaos Search. Picture running an Elasticsearch cluster without the painful, obnoxious, terrible parts of having to run Elasticsearch yourself. Your data lives in S3. They separate out the storage from the compute, so you query a bunch of containers that run and spin up or down as needed to service your workloads, and it presents as a fully compatible Elasticsearch API. So suddenly you're spending about 20% of the cost that you were before and getting similar performance characteristics for most workloads while being able to scale things effectively. These things can run in your own AWS account for those of you with compliance or data locality issues. It's absolutely something to take a look at. Chaos Search is not just a sponsor, they're a company that I frequently recommend to my clients just because it is that much better than anything else in the space. What else are you going to do? Go with Ultra Warm? I think not. My thanks to Chaos Search for their sponsorship of this episode. Please check them out at chaossearch.io. AWS Code Build now supports cross-account resource sharing, which, of course, has the unwanted side effect of turning who cost what and who pays for which into a giant confusing mess, which is why calling it Code Build is absolutely truth in labeling. Amazon CloudFront now supports 7 new data fields in access logs. Some of this is pretty common stuff, like time to first byte. But the real winner here for this feature is, of course, the CloudWatch Logs team themselves, because they are going to be able to bill for the increased data ingress for the space that those fields take up in the logs. Is that cynical? Yes, it is, but it's also the cost of doing business. DNS resolution for EKS clusters using private endpoints is now something you can do. Wait, what's that, haters? The private endpoints are looked up in my favorite database of all time, Route 53/DNS. That's right, Route 53, the best database, continues to rule everything around it. Introducing open monitoring with Prometheus for Amazon MSK. Normally, I would not have bothered to talk about this enhancement, but a quote-unquote friend of mine is on the Prometheus core team and will whine incessantly and at great volume if I don't include his project's moment in the sun in this podcast. You're welcome. Happy birthday. Reaching more customers with web and mobile chat on Amazon Connect. This is their effectively intercom competitor that was launched before reInvent. And my comment at the time was I had no idea what it was, who it was for, how it was built, because it didn't come with a blog post. That has finally been rectified, and friend of the show and common AWS Gadfly employee himself, Randall Hunt, has written it. It's a story that ties together not just the capability, but what I might use it for in a way that even I can understand. It's nice to see him blogging again as well, and I'm even willing to overlook the fact that the service itself is going to badger people on websites just like Intercom does today. There's a blog post on getting started with Amazon DynamoDB on the database blog, which if you're feeling a little bit behind in the world of databases, I think it's worth taking the time to take a look at. There are some use cases that require DynamoDB's advanced features. For everything else, there's Route 53. Using AWS Systems Manager Change Calendar to prevent changes during critical events. Fantastic. The Systems Manager Change Calendar now will keep you from accidentally deploying during Black Friday, or for that matter, any Friday at all. Somewhere, if she's listening to this podcast, Charity Majors just perked up at the idea of someone saying stupid things about not deploying on Fridays. This one's for you folks over at Honeycomb. And lastly, something that's uplifting, but I'll still make fun of it anyway, automating fall detection with AWS Deep Lens. It's great. It can detect when someone has fallen and summon authorities as needed. The problem is, if you take a look at nursing home studies, a very common place where people fall is, in fact, inside of the restroom. So what's the answer here? We're going to have Amazon's machine learning cameras hanging out in bathrooms now? Is that apparently the new state of the world? I'd like to hope not. But it's fascinating and uplifting and creepy and terrifying all at the same time. And if that isn't the best sales pitch for Amazon, I don't know what is. Thankfully, that's all that missed their reInvent launch deadlines, so it's a relatively light week. Thank you to the Amazon service teams for making my weekend a little bit easier. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave it a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. And if you've hated it, go ahead and leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts because, frankly, reviews are how we wind up growing the audience, which enables me to perform ever more ridiculous stunts on the air. I'm cloud economist Corey Quinn, and I will talk to you next week.
This has been a Humble Pod production. Stay humble.